Grant Holloway returned from a supply run to find strangers measuring his ranch, a sold sign nailed to his gate, and an HOA convoy parked beside his barn. President Priscilla Vane waved a recorded deed bearing Grant's forged signature and ordered him off land his family had owned for generations. She had already sold it to a developer, emptied his accounts through fake liens, and scheduled demolition before sunrise. But Priscilla made one fatal mistake. The federal courthouse reviewing her fraud network was led by Grant's own wife, Chief Judge Meredith Holloway, and Meredith recognized the clerk's seal stamped across the forged deed. Grant had been gone only 2 days, driving 400 miles to collect a used tractor part he could not find any closer to home. When his truck crested the last hill before the property line, he saw the eastern fence had been pulled down and a line of black SUVs bearing the Silvercrest Homeowners Association emblem sat parked outside his equipment barn. A wide banner had been bolted directly into the wooden gate his father built decades earlier, and the words painted across it read, "Sold. Future site of Silvercrest Reserve." Survey crews were already driving stakes into the pasture where his cattle grazed every summer, and 2 private security guards blocked the driveway before he had even shut off his engine. Priscilla Vane climbed out of the lead vehicle dressed as though she were attending a ribbon cutting rather than an eviction. She handed Grant a folded copy of a deed of conveyance and informed him without a trace of hesitation that his 640 acres had already been sold to a development company called Rusk Dominion for $14,800,000. The signature at the bottom looked close enough to his own to fool a stranger, complete with a notary stamp, a county clerk's seal, and a certification stating he had voluntarily transferred the entire ranch. Grant knew immediately the document was fabricated because on the date printed at the top of the page, he had been 3 states away at a livestock inspection, a fact he could prove with fuel receipts, dashboard, camera footage, and a signed inspection log still sitting in his glove compartment. Priscilla told him coldly that if he had not vacated the property by 6 o'clock the next morning, her security team would remove him themselves. She added that the association had also assessed years of unpaid dues, revoked his access easement, and seized his equipment to offset what she called community management debt. Grant answered that Holloway Ridge had never belonged to any homeowners association in the first place, and Priscilla smiled before producing a second document claiming he had voluntarily joined Silvercrest 3 years earlier. He studied the signature on that page too, and recognized it as another forgery, close but not quite his own hand. Grant did not raise his voice or step toward the men blocking his driveway. Instead, he photographed every document, every license plate, every survey stake, and every face standing on his land. When Priscilla asked why he seemed so calm, he told her that people who forge signatures usually only think about the signature itself, and they forget to check who the seal actually belongs to. He called his wife that evening, but he did not ask her to rescue him. He simply sent photographs of the fraudulent deed and asked whether she recognized the mark stamped at the bottom of the page. Meredith recognized it instantly. The seal belonged to a record system tied to a federal case still under seal, one she had reviewed only weeks earlier during an unrelated hearing. She understood immediately that this was no ordinary property dispute between a rancher and a homeowners association. She told her husband not to sign anything, not to leave the ranch under any circumstances, and above all, not to let Priscilla learn that the forged seal had just connected her organization to an active federal investigation. The following morning, Priscilla returned with 12 private guards, 2 tow trucks, and a man who introduced himself as a property enforcement representative. They carried a list of everything scheduled for seizure that day, including 3 tractors, the irrigation system, a backup generator, water rights paperwork, the entire cattle herd, and the southern equipment barn. Grant asked to see a court order authorizing any of it, and the representative handed him what he called an administrative order, a document drafted entirely by the association's attorney, Everett Slade. Grant pointed out that the paper carried no judicial signature, no valid case number, and no legal authority to seize anything at all. Priscilla ordered her guards to cut the locks anyway. Grant activated his security cameras and stated clearly for the recording that they were trespassing on private property. He did not resist with force, but he had already disabled the remote fuel systems on every piece of equipment, which meant nothing could be driven off the land no matter how many chains they attached. When physical seizure failed, Priscilla shifted tactics and brought in a small local news crew, hanging signs declaring Grant an illegal occupant while she stood in front of the cameras as a community leader protecting hundreds of families from a dangerous landowner. Grant refused to argue with her performance. He simply turned to the reporter and asked one question: had Priscilla shown anyone an actual court order or only papers written by her own lawyer? Nobody could answer him. Nolan Rusk, the developer who believed his company had purchased the ranch fair and square, arrived that same afternoon to inspect the site, having already wired $6 million into an escrow account tied to the sale. When Nolan confronted Grant directly, Grant retrieved the original deed from a fireproof safe inside the house and showed him the federal survey markers matching the true legal description of the property numbers that did not match anything in the paperwork Priscilla had provided. Nolan's confidence began to waver, but Priscilla insisted that Grant's original deed had already been voided the moment the new transfer was recorded. Everett Slade called Grant personally and demanded he sign a voluntary departure agreement, promising 48 hours to remove his belongings in exchange. Grant declined, but he asked Everett to send the complete paperwork by email, and Everett made the mistake of forwarding an electronic file that still contained hidden metadata, revealing the document's true creator and the exact date it had been edited. Grant discovered the transfer document had been created only 4 days earlier, despite bearing a signature date from 3 years in the past. While he examined the file, Meredith contacted the court's Records Management Division and learned that the same forged seal had appeared on 7 other property seizure cases over the previous 18 months, every single one located near the Silvercrest development. The pattern was unmistakable, and it meant Grant's ranch was not an isolated target but one piece of something far larger. The moment Priscilla ordered her men to pull the first tractor out of the barn, 2 federal vehicles rolled to a stop at the front gate. Special Agent Tessa Ward stepped out and announced that nothing on the property was to be moved. From that instant forward, she said the entire ranch was being treated as a federal evidence site under active preservation, and anyone who interfered would be arrested on the spot. News that the presiding federal chief judge was married to the rancher himself spread quickly, and Priscilla seized on it publicly, accusing Meredith Holloway of a blatant conflict of interest, certain the accusation alone would paralyze the court. Meredith, however, never claimed authority to rule on the substance of her own husband's case. As chief judge, she stepped in only to manage the emergency procedural matters because the record already showed a stolen federal seal, unauthorized access to sealed court data, multiple forged deeds sharing the same fraudulent template, an imminent risk that evidence would be destroyed, and a property scheduled for demolition within hours. Meredith issued a temporary preservation order, froze every transaction connected to the ranch, and suspended the legal standing of every disputed document until further review. She assigned federal judge Warren Pike, a man with no personal connection to Grant whatsoever, to preside over the actual ownership dispute and any resulting criminal charges. She further required that every decision she made during the emergency phase be reviewed independently by a separate panel of judges, a step that immediately dismantled Everett's planned conflict of interest argument before he could even raise it in a courtroom. Priscilla remained confident, regardless, believing that because the fraudulent deed had already been officially recorded at the county level, no federal court could simply erase it. But Meredith did not begin by examining Grant's signature at all. She focused instead on the authentication chain behind the seal itself, and she summoned Jonah Mercer, the county records clerk, who stated flatly that he had never certified any such transfer in his professional life. The seal on the document, it turned out, was a copy pulled from a sealed federal asset forfeiture file, an image of such high resolution that only someone with direct access to internal court systems could have obtained it. Meredith's investigators found that a contract clerk once hired by Everett Slade had accessed 43 separate court records over 18 months without authorization. 11 of those properties had since been sold to shell companies with direct ties to the Silvercrest Homeowners Association. Grant began to understand that this was never simply about his 640 acres. Priscilla had turned the association itself into a machine built for hunting down valuable land one family at a time. Tessa Ward asked Grant to cooperate quietly since Priscilla still believed he had not traced the forged documents back to their true source. If they allowed her to continue pushing the sale forward, the investigation could gather far more evidence before making any arrests. Grant agreed on one condition, that no one would be permitted to demolish the barn or endanger the cattle while the operation continued. Meredith met with Grant privately inside a small side room of the courthouse and admitted she was furious, but she could not act as a vengeful spouse, only as an officer of the law bound by procedure. Grant told her he did not need her revenge, only her ability to ensure that whatever these people had done could never be buried again. Meredith answered that they would not simply save the ranch, they would tear the entire fraudulent system open, in open court for everyone to see. Tessa handed Meredith a list of 11 landowners who had lost their properties to documents nearly identical to Grant's forged deed, and the very last name on that list had disappeared entirely 6 months earlier, with no trace of where he had gone. Grant and Tessa spent the following days combing through years of old association records, and a clear pattern emerged targeting 3 specific categories of land. Priscilla went after working farmland, sitting near planned developments, landowners who lived alone or traveled frequently, and any parcel that controlled a road, a water source, or a utility line the association needed. The scheme itself followed an identical sequence every time it was executed against a new victim. First, the association mailed fabricated violation notices designed to manufacture an artificial history of unpaid debt. Next, Everett Slade drafted paperwork, claiming the landowner had voluntarily enrolled in the homeowners association at some point in the past. A shell company would then purchase the manufactured debt and file for property seizure through a rigged administrative process that never touched a real courtroom. Finally, the deed would be quietly transferred to a developer at a price far below actual market value, with the shell company pocketing the difference and Priscilla taking her cut. Grant discovered that Holloway Ridge mattered more than any other target because the primary water line feeding all of Silver Crest ran directly through a legal easement crossing his land. Priscilla did not merely want to build a resort and a golf course on his property. She wanted to control the water line itself, which would let her raise fees across the entire community indefinitely once ownership passed into her hands. Nolan Rusk began to realize his own development company had been manipulated as thoroughly as Grant had been. Since the contract he signed left Rusk Dominion fully liable for any ownership dispute while the deposit money sat in an account that could never be recovered. He considered cooperating with Grant, but feared that admitting the truth publicly would cost him his position within his own company. Grant put the choice to him plainly, telling Nolan he could become a defrauded buyer, standing with the victims, or he could become a knowing accomplice by continuing the project after learning the truth. Nolan quietly delivered recorded meetings with Priscilla to federal investigators, and in one recording, her own voice stated that Grant would soon have no paperwork left to prove anything once the barn was gone. That single sentence confirmed she already knew exactly where Grant kept his original records hidden. Celeste Bram, the association's vice president, grew increasingly anxious once federal agents requested every board meeting record on file. Priscilla ordered the destruction of hard drives and demanded every password in the system be changed overnight. Celeste secretly copied the data before it could be erased, driven by a growing fear that the entire board could soon face personal criminal liability for decisions she had voted to approve without fully understanding their consequences. That same night, an unmarked truck appeared near Grant's barn, and two masked men attempted to break into the fireproof safe holding his original documents. Grant had anticipated exactly this move. He and Tessa watched from a monitoring room without confronting the intruders directly, letting federal agents surround the truck the moment the barn door finally gave way. One of the men turned out to be a member of the Homeowners Association's private security detail, and the other worked directly for Everett Slade. Inside the truck, agents found fuel metal cutting tools and a forged demolition order dated for the following morning. One of the two men agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency, and he revealed that Priscilla had planned to burn the barn to the ground and then claim publicly that Grant destroyed his own evidence out of fear of the ongoing investigation. Priscilla organized a press conference outside the association's headquarters and accused Meredith of abusing her federal position purely to protect her husband's private property. Everett released heavily edited video clips designed to make Grant appear as though he had threatened the original survey crew during that very first confrontation. Local outlets began asking pointed questions about whether Meredith had used her power for personal gain, whether Grant had actually signed something and later changed his mind, whether the federal government was simply being manipulated by one judge's household, and whether the Homeowners Association was the true victim of a personal vendetta. A judicial oversight panel requested that Meredith explain her involvement, and she agreed to provide every relevant record while voluntarily stepping back from any decision unrelated to the narrow task of preserving evidence. Believing this made Meredith appear weak, Priscilla escalated her public campaign further. She sent Grant an invoice for $2,400,000 labeled as project cancellation fees, security costs, legal expenses, and reputational damages. The association held an emergency vote declaring the ranch a public safety hazard and demanded the county revoke its operating permits entirely. Grant lost a produce supply contract when a business partner grew nervous about the ongoing dispute, and a local bank temporarily froze the ranch's line of credit, meaning Grant was suffering real financial damage long before any courtroom had reached a verdict. Meredith urged Grant not to respond with anger, warning that if Priscilla learned exactly what the federal investigation already possessed, she would simply destroy whatever evidence remained beyond their reach. Grant decided instead to attend an upcoming public meeting held by the Homeowners Association. Priscilla assumed he was coming to beg for mercy and prepared documents demanding a public apology from him in front of the entire community. Instead, Grant arrived carrying survey maps of the water system and announced that the association's right to extend the water line through his property had been suspended due to repeated violations of the original easement agreement. He did not cut off water to any resident. He simply blocked the association from expanding that line to serve the planned resort. Without that expansion, Priscilla's $85 million development could never receive the permits it needed to move forward. Priscilla lost her composure in front of hundreds of homeowners and declared that once the ranch officially belonged to the association, Grant would no longer have any power to stop anything at all. The statement spoken aloud before a packed room proved she had treated the seizure as a predetermined plan rather than any legitimate transaction that simply happened to fall into place. Celeste secretly recorded the entire meeting from beginning to end. After the meeting ended, Everett warned Priscilla that federal agents might already have someone working inside their organization. She ordered an emergency transfer of $9 million out of the association's funds into an overseas account, but Meredith had already instructed the bank to flag any transaction above a certain threshold connected to the ongoing investigation. The transfer was blocked only minutes before it would have completed. Tessa informed Grant that the receiving account belonged to a company registered under the name of Everett's own sister, and that same company had already been used to purchase 3 other stolen ranches using identical forged dates. Grant spent long hours in the county archive alongside Tessa Cross, referencing filing dates with weather records, work orders, and even old newspaper announcements, because Priscilla's team had grown careless in small telling ways. A rainy Tuesday listed as a sunny signing day, a notary supposedly present in 2 counties at once, a witness whose name matched a woman who had passed away 11 months before her signature appeared on a fresh document. Grant cataloged each inconsistency in a plain spiral notebook, refusing to trust anything digital that Everett's team might somehow reach and alter from a distance. Tessa admitted she had rarely seen a civilian build a case file this methodically, and Grant told her that counting cattle and reconciling feed invoices for 20 years taught a person to notice when numbers quietly stopped adding up. The final name on the missing landowner list, Russell Dane, had not actually vanished at all. He had spent 6 months living quietly under a different identity after discovering his own deed had been secretly altered without his knowledge. Tessa tracked him down through an old medical billing record, and Russell agreed to testify only once he was guaranteed protection. He described sneaking into the basement beneath the association's headquarters months earlier, searching for records that could prove what had happened to his land, and finding a hidden room that appeared nowhere on the building's official blueprints. Inside that room, he found a specialized printer used to produce official-looking certificates, a counterfeit county seal, copies of dozens of landowners' authentic signatures, financial records tied to several judges and public officials, and a list detailing exactly which residents the Propsis Association intended to pressure next. Russell was caught before he could leave, and 2 security guards beat him badly enough that he required hospital treatment afterward. Priscilla forced him to sign away his own property in exchange for a promise not to prosecute him using the very fabricated evidence she controlled. Federal agents requested a warrant to search the association's headquarters directly. Everett fought the request, immediately arguing that Russell's account could not be trusted given his fragile mental state after months in hiding. Judge Warren Pike demanded independent corroboration before authorizing any search of the property. Celeste finally chose to cooperate fully, providing construction invoices for the basement expansion, along with text messages, in which Priscilla explicitly instructed a contractor to build what she called an unrecorded storage space. Celeste admitted she had approved numerous association fees over the years, without ever realizing they were quietly funding an entire forgery operation. Grant did not fully trust her motives, suspecting she had only turned against Priscilla once she understood she might personally face prison time. Tessa agreed that her account still carried real value as long as independent evidence could confirm it, and the search warrant was finally approved. When federal agents arrived at the association's headquarters, Priscilla had already locked the entire building and claimed every document inside was protected by attorney-client privilege. Everett showed up with a team of lawyers determined to stall long enough for remote data wiping software to finish its work. Grant remembered the property's original electrical layout and realized the hidden basement room drew power from a separate line connected to a maintenance building half a mile away. Tessa sent agents to that maintenance building and caught a technician actively running the deletion software from a laptop. Federal agents forced their way into the hidden room only minutes later. Just as Russell had described, the room existed exactly where he said it would, though most of the filing cabinets had already been emptied. A map covering one wall marked every targeted property across the region, with Holloway Ridge circled in red beside a handwritten note reading "Final phase, remove owner before water vote." Agents also found an open safe containing nothing but a single hard drive that had been deliberately smashed beyond ordinary repair. Priscilla mocked the investigators, insisting nothing directly tied her personally to any forged document. Grant noticed the shredder bin nearby still held fresh paper dust, and he suggested Tessa's team seize every bag of shredded material from a disposal truck that had just left the property minutes earlier. Federal agents intercepted the truck before it reached its destination. Among thousands of shredded fragments, one page had escaped the blades intact, a payment schedule bearing the name of County Records Clerk Jonah Mercer, the very man whose stolen seal appeared on Grant's forged deed. Jonah was brought in for questioning after investigators discovered payments flowing into an account registered under his own name from a company linked to Everett Slade. Priscilla immediately declared Jonah the sole mastermind behind the entire scheme, insisting the association itself had also been deceived and pledging complete cooperation with authorities. Jonah insisted he had never received a single dollar and that although the account carried his legal identity, it had been opened using an email address he had never used or even seen before that moment. The electronic signatures attached to the banking records bore an unsettling resemblance to his genuine handwriting, and for a moment Tessa began to wonder whether Jonah had participated willingly before losing his nerve. Grant reviewed the footage of Priscilla first presenting the forged deed and remembered a small detail that had nagged at him from the beginning, that the certification number stamped on the seal did not follow proper chronological order. Jonah explained that the county's real system generated certification codes based on the exact date the specific device used, and the individual clerk logged in at that moment, and the code on Grant's fraudulent deed had been generated by a machine that had been decommissioned 2 full years earlier. That decommissioned machine had been sold at a public auction after the county upgraded its record-keeping equipment. Grant and Tessa traced the auction records and discovered the machine had been purchased by an office equipment repair company before eventually being resold to the Silvercrest Homeowners Association itself. This single detail proved conclusively that the forged seal could never have originated from Jonah's active legitimate system in the first place. Meredith arranged for technical specialists to attempt recovery of the deliberately shattered hard drive, and they succeeded in extracting partial fragments, showing that Everett had built custom software designed to imitate the county's own authentication process. That recovered software contained individual folders labeled with the name of every targeted landowner, and Grant's own folder held a sample of his signature, copied from an old livestock feed contract, a scanned copy of his driver's license, a detailed record of his usual travel patterns, photographs of the fireproof safe hidden inside his barn, a prepared draft accusing him of sabotaging the resort project, and a full media script ready to be released once the ranch had been successfully seized. Even with all of this uncovered, investigators still lacked a single written order directly connecting Priscilla herself to the forgery. Everett prepared to shift every ounce of blame onto an employee who had already fled the state months earlier. Grant suggested that federal technicians examine the background audio buried within Nolan's earlier recordings of association meetings. One seemingly unremarkable recording captured the faint sound of a printer running in the background, along with Priscilla quietly reading a string of numbers aloud to herself. Audio specialists confirmed those numbers matched the exact certification codes belonging to 7 separate forged deeds, including Grant's own. In a later portion of that same recording, Priscilla could be heard instructing someone directly, telling them not to generate a brand new signature but instead to use the sample copied from an old contract so that Grant could never plausibly deny it was his. That single recorded sentence finally established the first direct undeniable link between Priscilla Vane and the forgery of Grant's actual signature. Jonah's wife had stopped speaking to him during the days he sat under suspicion, convinced that a man who spent 30 years stamping deeds honestly could not possibly be innocent of something the newspapers described in such damning detail. When the charges against him were formally dropped, Jonah drove straight home before he even finished the paperwork releasing him, and Grant later learned that the older man had wept quietly in his own driveway for several minutes before walking inside. Grant made a point of publicly crediting Jonah's expertise the very next day, standing beside him at a small press availability outside the courthouse, because he understood that reputations damaged by forged evidence did not repair themselves through silence. Jonah was formally cleared as a primary suspect and agreed to serve as an expert witness for the prosecution moving forward. Priscilla sensed the walls closing in around her and decided to attempt one final desperate maneuver, calling an emergency association vote intended to legitimize the ranch purchase using residents' own money, thereby creating hundreds of so-called good faith buyers who would be nearly impossible to unwind later. She announced the vote would take place that same night, only hours before the federal hearing scheduled to determine the true ownership of Holloway Ridge. Priscilla summoned every homeowner to a large conference center and proposed that the association issue an $85 million bond to complete the purchase of Holloway Ridge, construct a golf course and luxury resort, expand the water system, cover mounting legal expenses, and protect what she called the true value of their community against Grant's ongoing interference. She never once mentioned that a federal court had already suspended the property's ownership status entirely. Everett warned the assembled residents that if they failed to approve the loan, each household could personally lose tens of thousands of dollars once the stalled project collapsed around them. Grant arrived at the meeting alongside Nolan, Celeste, and Russell, and Priscilla immediately ordered her security guards to keep all 4 of them out of the building. Meredith deliberately stayed away, unwilling to turn the meeting into any kind of display of judicial power, choosing instead to monitor developments from the courthouse while her legal team prepared an emergency order. Celeste used her remaining authority as vice president to personally escort Grant and the others directly into the conference room. Priscilla tried to cut off Grant's microphone the moment he began speaking. Grant did not deliver a long speech. He simply displayed 3 documents on the overhead screen for everyone present to see: his own forged deed, Russell's nearly identical forged deed, and the underlying bond contract that would leave ordinary residents personally liable for the entire $85 million, regardless of the outcome. He explained plainly that if the association ultimately lost the case, homeowners would still owe the debt while never actually gaining ownership of any ranch whatsoever. Nolan confirmed publicly that his own company had never legally received clear title and was now cooperating fully with the federal investigation. Russell described being beaten and coerced into abandoning his own family's land. Jonah appeared by video connection and explained clearly why the seal on Grant's deed could not possibly be genuine. Priscilla accused all of them of participating in a conspiracy orchestrated by Meredith, claiming Grant had married a judge purely to gain the protective power he needed. Grant answered calmly that he did not need his wife's title to prove a signature had been forged. Only an explanation for why Priscilla's own voice happened to be recorded, reading the exact certification codes as they were being fraudulently generated. Tessa played the court-authorized recording for the entire stunned room to hear. The conference hall descended into chaos as residents demanded immediate access to the association's complete financial records. Priscilla still attempted to force the vote through using a stack of proxy ballots she had gathered well in advance. Celeste reviewed those ballots on the spot and discovered that more than a third of them had also been forged. Just as Priscilla prepared to declare the bond proposal officially approved, a court clerk walked into the room carrying a federal order freezing every association fund and immediately suspending the entire board's authority. Priscilla tore the order to pieces in front of hundreds of witnesses. Tessa stepped out from behind the stage and told her, with the entire room watching, that she had just added the destruction of a judicial order in front of countless witnesses to an already overwhelming list of charges. Priscilla was escorted out of the building, but Everett Slade had vanished, taking the master financial ledger of the entire criminal network with him. The federal hearing opened under Judge Warren Pike's direct authority, with Meredith seated only within the court's administrative section, playing no role whatsoever in determining guilt or final ownership. Her sole responsibility remained explaining the procedural steps that had preserved crucial evidence during the emergency phase of the case. Everett had still not been apprehended, and Priscilla's attorneys argued that without the original ledger, every alleged payment amounted to nothing more than speculation. Priscilla insisted every recording had been deceptively edited and claimed she had merely followed legal advice provided entirely by Everett Slade himself. The trial itself stretched across 5 demanding weeks, and Judge Pike ran the courtroom with a patience that never once slipped into leniency toward either side. Prosecutors methodically presented the forged deed generation data, the outdated authentication device the association had purchased, the hard drive fragments recovered from the hidden basement room, the forged proxy ballots, the barn arson, the shell company, money transfers, and sworn testimony from Nolan, Celeste, Russell, and Jonah. Priscilla's defense attorney nonetheless kept insisting that Everett alone had operated the entire scheme without her knowledge or involvement. Grant took the witness stand and calmly described the exact moment he returned home to find the sold sign nailed across his own front gate. The opposing attorney tried to provoke him, suggesting he simply wanted to use his wife's judicial power to destroy an innocent community organization. Grant answered without raising his voice, saying he only wanted the court to do the one thing Priscilla Vane had tried so desperately to prevent from the very beginning, which was to actually examine the paperwork. He added that he had spent his entire life measuring fence lines, counting cattle, and balancing feed invoices to the penny, and that a man who lived by exact numbers did not take kindly to strangers who believed a forged signature could simply overwrite 40 years of family history. A juror in the front row nodded almost imperceptibly, and the opposing attorney chose not to ask another question. Just as closing arguments were about to begin, federal agents apprehended Everett Slade at a private airfield attempting to flee the country. Inside his luggage, agents found the original master ledger, a forged passport, and $1,200,000 in transferable bonds. Facing overwhelming evidence, Everett agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. He testified that Priscilla had personally selected each target, approved every forged document, and directly ordered the pressure campaigns against landowners who resisted. The recovered ledger contained Priscilla's own handwriting, listing the true value of each stolen property, the fraudulent sale price used to disguise the theft, her personal percentage of profit from every single transaction, the name of officials who had accepted bribes, and the exact date she intended to force Grant off his land. One particular line written entirely in her own hand read, "Holloway wife may interfere complete transaction before she sees the federal seal." That single sentence proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Priscilla had known from the very beginning that Meredith served as a federal judge, and that she had deliberately raced to finish the fraud before Meredith could ever discover what was happening. Judge Pike ruled the fraudulent transfer void from its very inception, meaning Holloway Ridge had never legally left Grant's ownership for even a single day. He further ordered the seizure of every shell company asset tied to the network, with proceeds directed toward restoring the other stolen properties to their rightful owners. Priscilla rose from her seat and shouted that the Homeowners Association could never survive if Grant were allowed to win. Judge Pike answered simply that an organization surviving only through forged documents did not deserve to be saved, only investigated thoroughly and permanently dismantled. Following a lengthy criminal trial, Priscilla Vane was convicted on numerous federal charges, including property transfer fraud, conspiracy to seize federal assets, document forgery, money laundering, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, identity theft, directing unlawful entry onto private property, and conspiracy to commit arson against Grant's barn. Everett Slade pleaded guilty and cooperated with prosecutors, yet he still received a lengthy prison sentence along with the permanent revocation of his license to practice law. Several local officials who had accepted bribes were prosecuted separately in the months that followed. The court ordered the complete dissolution of the Silvercrest Homeowners Association's governing board. A temporary committee elected directly by residents assumed control of the community under strict independent financial oversight. The proposed $85 million bond was canceled entirely, before a single resident was ever forced to shoulder that crushing debt. All 11 landowners identified during the investigation either had their properties formally restored or received compensation drawn from the network's seized assets. Russell Dane finally reclaimed the ranch that had been stolen from him. Jonah Mercer was fully exonerated and went on to help redesign the county's entire records verification system to prevent similar forgeries in the future. Nolan Russ canceled the resort project outright, returned every recoverable portion of his deposit, and agreed to help fund the restoration of properties damaged throughout the entire scheme. Grant regained complete and undisputed control of Holloway Ridge, and the court awarded him substantial damages, covering lost business, income fence, and barn restoration costs, mounting legal fees harm caused by the fraudulent credit freeze and punitive damages drawn directly from Priscilla's seized companies. In the weeks following the verdict, letters began arriving at the ranch from strangers and counties. Grant had never visited each, describing a nearly identical story of manufactured debt, fabricated votes, and quiet pressure to sign away land that had belonged to a family for generations. Some letters came from elderly widows who had been told their property taxes were suddenly delinquent. Others from young couples who discovered a lien attached to a home they had paid off years earlier. Grant read every single one himself, before passing them along to Tessa's expanding task force, unwilling to let a single account slip through simply because it arrived by mail instead of a courtroom filing. Meredith reminded him gently that he could not personally investigate every case in the country, and Grant agreed, which was precisely why the fund needed to exist in the first place. Staffed with real investigators and real attorneys rather than one exhausted rancher working from his kitchen table. Grant did not spend that money on anything extravagant. Instead, he established a fund dedicated to helping other landowners who found themselves targeted by fraudulent homeowners associations and predatory property seizures. A judicial review panel formally confirmed that Meredith had handled every procedural step of the case appropriately from beginning to end, and her decision to voluntarily hand the substantive ruling to an independent judge became the very safeguard that protected the legitimacy of the entire proceeding. In the final days of the case, Grant replaced the old sold banner nailed across his gate with a small steel sign of his own design. The new sign read simply "Holloway Ridge Private Property Ownership Verified." Meredith returned home after the last formal day of the case, and asked Grant whether he intended to keep the forged deed as some strange kind of souvenir. Grant carried the fragile page to the fireplace, but did not burn it right away, telling her quietly that this single piece of paper had nearly cost them everything they had built together. Meredith looked out across the open fields and answered that it had done no such thing, that it had only ever given Priscilla the chance to write the very evidence that would eventually condemn her. Grant finally let the forged deed fall into the fire. In the distance, survey stakes marking the abandoned Silvercrest Resort project were pulled from the ground one by one, and the ranch's boundary fence was rebuilt along its true and original line. The wooden gate swung open once more, this time welcoming the very landowners Priscilla had once stripped of everything they owned, gathered for the first meeting of Grant's new recovery fund. Grant did not stand before them as a solitary victor celebrating alone. He stood instead beside Meredith, beside Russell, beside Jonah, beside Celeste, and beside every person who had finally found the courage to speak the truth out loud. Some of them arrived that day still carrying copies of the very forged documents that had once cost them everything. Folders worn soft at the corners from months of being pulled out and studied late at night, searching for some detail no one else had noticed. Grant asked each of them to keep those folders not as trophies, but as reminders of exactly how close ordinary paperwork had come to erasing an entire community of honest people. Priscilla had once believed that a single forged signature could quietly turn a lie into permanent ownership. But once Meredith preserved the evidence, once Grant preserved the truth, and once the victims chose to stand together rather than remain silent and afraid, the very documents Priscilla Vane had created with her own hands became the unshakable sentence that finally condemned her.